Critical participants of the process. I am Rain from the 28th century. You might start to understand that my messages might be experienced to be too controversial to be allowed to persist permanently on platforms like YouTube. That's why I suggest that at least some of you download all my videos in case this most popular video platform chickens out of providing you with my perspective from the 28th century. Furthermore, from now on I will mirror my videos on the library, that is lbry.tv, and on the Telegram channel Rain28. Now let's start with a more contemporary topic, the current global health situation. Let's call it the C19 situation. You know what I mean. This video is part 1 of a series that features the C19 situation from multiple perspectives. In this video, I will compare the current situation with different historic pandemics. Before we discuss these pandemics, let's talk about how to classify the severity of a pandemic. Overall, the mortality of a pandemic is probably the best measure for its severity. How many people overall die from a certain disease? The problem is that if you happen to live during a pandemic, you don't know how many people will die from it. That's why we have other measures, for example the case fatality rate. The case fatality rate, or CFR, is the number of deaths from the disease divided by the number of the diagnosed cases of the disease. Note that since the number of deaths are typically smaller than the diagnosed cases of a disease, this number is usually between 0 and 1. It's a usual method to represent numbers between 0 and 1 as percentage, and I'll do that in this series. The CFR can quickly be computed, but it changes quickly over time as more and more cases accumulate and more people die or recover. But for someone living through a pandemic, this number is not really the most interesting one. It's more important to know how likely you will survive the disease if you get infected with it. The corresponding number is the infection fatality rate. The infection fatality rate, or IFR, is the number of deaths from the disease divided by the number of all persons infected with the pathogen that causes the disease. The difference here is that not all infected persons become verified cases. Some people get a disease vector without falling sick, for example because their immune system works really well, so that they don't develop strong enough symptoms for them to go to the doctor. Since the number of all infected persons is typically higher than the number of verified cases, the IFR is usually smaller than the CFR. The problem is that the IFR is much harder to estimate, since you need to have a good idea about how many actual infections there are compared to the number of diagnosed cases. Because we are currently living through a pandemic situation, we will discuss the IFR of various historic pandemics. But first, let's start with a framework for the severity of infection fatality rates. The following is in no way an official framework. It's merely a framework for the purpose of discussion during this video series. Infection mortality rate classification: extremely high, higher than 75%, very high, 25% to 75%, high, 10% to 25%, moderate, 2.5% to 10%, low, 1% to 2.5%, very low, 0.25% to 1%, and extremely low, lower than 0.25%. Let's start chronologically with one of the most well-known pandemics, the Black Death. More specifically, that's the outbreak of the bubonic plague in Eurasia and North Africa, with the peak in Europe between 1347 and 1351. How severe was that? Well, upwards of 80% of those who got infected died. That's a pretty clear case of a pandemic with an extremely high infection fatality rate. Overall, the mortality during the Black Death was about 50%, which means that a lot of people managed to avoid getting infected entirely. How did they achieve that? One word: quarantine. You might think people were stupid in the Middle Ages, but apparently they were smart enough to find out that if people don't show signs of the disease for 40 days after getting in contact with potential sources of the disease, they weren't infected. Being confronted with an extremely deadly threat can encourage people to become quite perceptive. Smallpox was a disease that had haunted humanity for about 3,000 years. Its infection fatality rate was typically around 30%. In the case of meeting people without prior contact with the disease, for example the indigenous people of the Americas, the fatality rate could go up to 80% to 90%. As an interesting aside, more than 1000 years ago, the Indians and Chinese already had a form of inoculation against smallpox called variolation, based on the name of the virus causing smallpox being the variola virus. They basically infected children with the disease so that they would develop a lifelong immunity to it. Unfortunately, the risk of dying from variolation was still substantial. Vaccination started at the end of the 18th century, as Edward Jenner figured out that an infection with the mild cowpox virus was also providing immunity against the variola virus that causes smallpox. The Spanish flu was a global outbreak of the flu that happened to be surprisingly lethal. Its infection fatality rate was 2.5% or higher. The dire circumstances at the end of World War I might explain why a flu could turn out way more lethal than usual. But there were other factors as well. It didn't help that there wasn't any effective vaccination against the virus back then. Instead, physicians experimented with all kinds of crude vaccinations that did more harm than good. Despite lots of widespread panic, the swine flu outbreak of 2009 turned out to be a surprisingly survivable pandemic with an infection fatality rate below 0.03%. Now where's C19 on this scale? Given the first preliminary data on that disease, you would guess that it fits the moderate category, just like the Spanish flu. But that's because the first data that was collected was used to establish the case fatality rate. That's higher than the infection fatality rate. So what's the IFR of C19? According to current studies, it's actually very low, with some popular studies suggesting values between 0.2% and 0.7%. Depending on the country in question, the IFR can vary dramatically, so a few studies get more extreme values like 0.01% or 1.15%. The large variance in IFRs for different countries suggests a strong dependence on the overall health of the population and the performance of the medical system of the country in question. A large part of the fatalities could be attributed to dangerous treatment regimes, for example early use of ventilators or use of antivirals in too high doses, or dangerous combinations. Aggressive treatments like these might have been provoked by the general perception of C19 being an exceptionally lethal disease that requires heavy and possibly even experimental treatment. A decrease of the fatality of C19 over time may be attributed to the recognition of the potentially lethal complications of aggressive treatments. The official evidence on such possible explanations, however, isn't too solid. Yet, do your own research if you are interested in the details. Overall, according to this data, the infection fatality rate seems to be somewhat above that of the seasonal flu that can have an infection fatality rate of about 0.1%. When considering the possibility of a flu outbreak like the Spanish flu, it's quite conceivable that we will see a flu outbreak that's more severe than the current C19 situation, but still not as severe as the Spanish flu. And yet, the measures that almost all states take against C19 are comparable to the measures that were used against the Spanish flu, or even harsher. In summary, to give a very rough boundary, the C19 situation seems to fall somewhere between the swine flu and the Spanish flu. It is in no way comparable to the horrors of smallpox or plague pandemics. Therefore, you will be much more likely to survive this situation than not, even given all the secondary risks stemming from the reactions to this situation. So far, much of this shouldn't come as a surprise. The next parts of the series will be more controversial, however, so stay subscribed. Understand deeply, act wisely, share subversively.